Yeah, hello everybody. This morning, oh yes, I have somebody here, and you don't see anything. And yeah, um, today macroeconomics, and I think you all got the news yesterday because it was everywhere in the media, and well, you can see it. What we have heard yesterday about the Nobel Prize in Economics is something in between what I told you in the beginning of this lecture when we distinguished what we are doing when we are scientists and what we are doing when we are, so to speak, some experts and talking to the politicians. So the difference between positive and normative statements. Well, of course, here we have these three guys, Darren Acemoglu, Simon Johnson, and James Robinson, and they got more or less their Nobel Prize because they looked for a long, long time period, even longer than I did it. Well, I showed you where the circular flow came from, also 300 years ago, and they also looked how developed countries, how did they develop economically, and of course, they looked mainly how did they perform in GDP growth. And then they looked what are the reasons, because some countries have had higher growth rates over the last 200-300 years, and what are the reasons that some countries performed much better? Well, and one main reason was that they could distinguish between countries which have a democratic history and other countries. So what they found that they did just some regressions, and that they found here, can I highlight this? No. That they find a statistically significant positive effect of democracy and future GDP per capita. And even they said within 25 years of a starting process of democracy, this just would mean everything else is constant, that the democratic country has 20 to 25% higher GDP, 1/4. And this is really, really a high number. And why did I said that this is related to my distinction between positive and normative statements? Well, hopefully these three guys are good scientists, so they looked just neutrally at the data, and then afterwards they start to interpret the data, and they found this relationship between democratic structures and GDP growth. Well, and now we have the Nobel Committee, and we take our situation in the world today, when this Nobel Committee is choosing the Nobel laureates. Well, the prize in economics, it doesn't directly is related to Alfred Nobel in his testament. There was no prize in economics. This prize in economics was later on invented by the Swedish central bank, Svenska Riksbanken, in the late 1960s. But anyway, it is, of course, in the memory of Alfred Nobel. And if we look in his testament, then he wrote down what was really important for mankind. And this is, of course, when you choose then the Nobel laureates, this is, of course, then a normative statement. Well, and if you see this, what they found here, 20 to 25%, when you just have a country or two countries which are today not have democratic society, and then they start one, for example, an autocracy, the other one democratic, and then in the next 20-25 years you have a quarter higher living standard, so to speak, in the democratic country. Well, and you can think of what this means if these guys are now in our days are chosen as Nobel laureates. If you look around in Europe, there's a war in the East. If you look in the Middle East, and even if we look in to Asia, what is happening between Taiwan and China? Well, so this is, of course, choosing these three guys in these days is, of course, also a normative statement. Yeah, and if you want to read further, or here I just also had a look in their main publication some 10, 20 years ago. And here is this what they did in their regressions. So they looked almost at every country in the world. On the vertical axis is GDP per capita, and on the horizontal axis is protection against risk and expropriation. Well, what does it mean? Risk against expropriation. Well, you own your own property. You have property rights. This is my house. And nobody can just go to you and say, well, it's not your house anymore, because then you have rights. And in which kind of society do you have these rights that you can say, this is my house? In a democracy. In an autocratic regime, there can always somebody come to you and say, well, anyway, this is not your house anymore. Or if you look to Russia, sometimes you will be thrown out of the window. And then you are dead. This is also, in general, prohibited in a democracy. Okay, and what you see then here is that under this regression line, so China, Russia, on average, low GDP growth. And what one can't see, because here on the upper right side, there are so many countries. So they are lying all over at the more or less same point. So all these countries are more or less, with these high growth rates, the democratic societies in the world. Well, and this is, of course, at first only just a descriptive statement. Well, you just find it. There's no causality. And then you can read further, and then they made their arguments, because they say that there is causality between property rights, between a democratic society and high standard of living. And it is really, really interesting to read their publications. And I think I gave you also the links. Where are they? Didn't I put it in here? Oh, sorry. Then I put it on my, think, on my web page. Here we are. Yeah, here I put the links. These are two of the main publications. And then I put them also here in the slides. This with a link and the other one. Yeah, and yeah, the most maybe significant example where nature has done, I think, unfortunately, just a social experiment over the last 70 years is if you look at the difference between North and South Korea in living standard. Well, and I think we all know, especially when South Korea then overcame their military dictatorship in the 70s, in the 80s, they really outperformed, and now South Korea has almost or has a living standard of Western European countries. So they just speeded up within 40 years to grow very, very fast. And if you compare the standard of living in South Korea with North Korea, one of the poorest countries in the world, then you have this huge discrepancy between the development, one, with the democratic society, and of course, North Korea with a purely dictatorship. Well, and in generally, I think qualitatively, you quite often see this. Look, for example, if you go to Cyprus, the northern part and the southern part. Also, high difference between living standard. Or, of course, we are here in Germany, and if we look at Western Germany and Eastern Germany, just starting from the 1950s. And we did this social experiment, so to speak, until 1991. Okay, so that's for the Nobel Prize. Yesterday, here you can click on and then you can directly, I hope this works, yeah, control and, no, this was wrong. And then you come directly to the Nobel Prize web page, and then in the second week of December there will be the prizes given to the people, and then always they held a speech, and they are giving also a lecture in Stockholm and at the University of Uppsala. Fortunately, I studied at Uppsala in 1996, so I heard all the Nobel laureates then giving their lectures at the University of Uppsala. And all these lectures are also published then. And this is also always very fruitful to read them, these lectures of these Nobel laureates. But I will give you then also the link in December. Yeah, and then also I found, well, in the end, maybe we will talk about this in the lecture, that Darren Acemoglu, he wrote, yeah, one of the standard textbooks on growth theory. And I found that you have for free his introduction to modern economic growth. So if somebody, you see here 700 pages, if you are interested, more interested in economic growth in general and all the models behind it, we won't do it until this in the introductory course in macroeconomics. Then I would recommend to have a look in this textbook. And I gave you also here the link. Okay, so, but then back to our lecture and also back to GDP, because what was GDP? Let's go back to our definition. Gross domestic product is the total market value of all finished goods and services produced within a country's borders in a specific time period. And then we said, well, we can get these GDP from three different sides: the production approach, the expenditure approach, and the income approach. And let me summarize this before we go on with the new content. So, what did we have? GDP, production approach, expenditure approach, and income approach. So, and then we looked at the main parts from these three different sides. And what did we have in the production approach? This was then more or less this picture here. So 55% in the wholesale and retail, roughly 25% in manufacturing, 5% in construction, and 15% in wholesale and 55% in private and public services. So let's take this here. Private and public services, roughly 55%, manufacturing, roughly 25%, construction, 5%, oops, oh, my camera is going elsewhere. Here we are. And wholesale trade, roughly 15%. And you have also to keep in mind in this introductory course, not relative to GDP, but relative to grow value added. GVA is quite often the abbreviation. Then expenditure. What was the main part of the expenditure approach? When you have your money, what is then what you are doing? Think of the circular flow, then we are consuming. So private consumption. This was also roughly 50% right now. Well, we can consume, or especially the enterprises, what they are doing. As households, we too, but the main part is done of economic activity by the enterprises. Anybody? Well, go just back into the slides. Here we are. So these two, investment, and the other one, government consumption. Okay? Government consumption roughly 23% and investment roughly 22%. I told you if we go just more or less 10 years back in time, then we could say that private consumption was roughly 55% and 20 and 20. This one can more easily recapitulate, but it really dropped this part of private consumption relative now here to GDP. And well, the main reasons are now the, so to speak, new tasks we have. That after Corona crisis, the especially the public sector stepped in with programs, and then afterwards we have the war in Ukraine. There we need public spending, and of course we need public spending within the tasks due to climate change, and of course in Germany also because of the demographic situation that we become older and older and older. Well, and the last one is external contribution. This is just exports minus imports, and this is still roughly 5%. Well, and the last one, this was, of course, relative to GDP. And the last one, the income approach. This was this diagram, and this was the distinction between the income coming from the two main production factors, labor and capital. So, labor, income, and capital income. And then we had the labor share of roughly 2/3 or 70%, and this is relative to national income. Well, and the explicit distinction between these three concepts in order to calculate the economic performance, we had it here on this slide, and then I will highlight this in red. Here you have the national income. Here you have gross value added, and of course in the middle the gross domestic product. So then more or less keep this slide in mind. This is more or less a summarization of what we have done within the lecture when we were talking what is GDP and economic performance measured by GDP of a country. And now we want to the system of general economic aims within a country, and I told you this is quite specific for Germany because we defined this system of aims even in a law. This you don't find in other countries, but of course if we are talking about economic policy, then of course more or less every country is looking at these main aggregates which we find behind these aims. So because of the Nobel Prize, we already talked today a lot about economic growth, and this will be then mainly measured by the change of GDP. Then price level stability, that we keep inflation in line, and we will also talk why do we care about price stability? Why do we care economically about inflation? For example, if you look at this central diagram of economics, supply and demand, well, and then we say, let's let it be done by the market to find the equilibrium. And from this, directly, we cannot deduce the aim of price level stability, because here we just say, let do the market everything, and then the market is just finding its price. And at the first step, the price can be everywhere. Why should we have then price level stability in general? And we will talk about this because why this is really a good aim which we should follow. Then, of course, this is directly related with economic growth. We talked about this because of the income approach. One of the main factors, and we see labor share is 2/3, so it is the main factor of production is labor. So high level unemployment would be also an aim, and this measured by the unemployment rate. And then, of course, we are not alone in the world. So we have a look at external balance, and sometimes we then talk about that maybe a good aim could be exports minus imports exports and imports are in balance. But we will see this definite aim we don't follow in Germany, although we find it in a law. And I will explain you why, because this has quite often historical reasons. And that exports and imports are in balance. This is hard to economically argue that this would be a good aim if we have an economic framework like we find it today. If we go back 60 years in time, then we will see that in these times it would have been a good aim, but in these times we had another economic framework, and we will talk about this when we come to this aim. Okay, then let's start with the first one, steady and appropriate economic growth. Well, and I already said to you, we look at GDP, but if we then want to interpret the development of GDP as something like the living standard, if we divide, for example, GDP by the number of the citizens of a country, so then we could say, well, this is our total income which we have, and if we spread this to all our citizens, 4 billion euros roughly in Germany, 80 million people. This means every year, every German citizen would have 50,000 euros per year. Well, I think if you would start right now a new job, you would be quite happy if you are earning 50,000 euros per year. It is not that much, but it's okay, I think. So, but in this case, if we think about it, what does it mean to have 50,000 euros? Is it good or bad? There we have one main general problem. Because it is not just good to have 50,000 euros within a year, or let's say I can spend 2,000 euros freely every month or something like this. What is behind? And there you can think on your micro course. What can you buy with this money? This is what you think about it. Well, and this, of course, depends what is the price of the goods and services you want due to your dependent on your preferences. What is the price of the goods and services you want to have? And if the price is very high, then of course 50,000 euros a year means less utility compared to a situation where the price level is lower. Well, and then you can just think backward in time 4 years before we had this large price increase of 10% roughly in some month. Think of just you are going for lunch or for dinner and compare this in 2090 and now. The difference between what you are paying for a dinner is quite large. And therefore, we have to care. Let's go back to the definition of GDP. We have to think about this part of the definition, market value. And this is then, so to speak, the nominal value of GDP. We calculate this number by the actual prices. But if we want to interpret GDP as something like the living standard, then not the number 4 billion is what we care about, but how much goods and services can we buy with our income. And therefore, we are measuring then steady and appropriate growth, not by the total market value, but we go then, and we will go in this a little bit deeper in a minute, we go to the so-called real GDP. And what means coming from the nominal concept to the real concept, this means somehow we want to get rid of the price fluctuations. So to speak, we can say that GDP is just the sum of price of good one times the quantity of good one. P2, X2, and so on. Let's say N goods. And then, of course, this number can increase because the prices are increasing. But we are consuming still the same quantities. We are buying the same number of cars. We are going to holidays as often as before. Only maybe the prices have doubled. Do we feel then better? Of course not. We are still consuming the same. And therefore, we want to get rid going to real GDP, we want to get rid of the price changes. Only changes in quantity matter for a change in living standard. And how we do this, this is not a simple way, there is no simple way to do this. We will do, I will show you in a minute how this is done today. Well, and then of course, the overall number of GDP in a country can also change if you have many immigrants. Think about the situation in 21-22, Ukraine war, about 1 to 1.5 million Ukrainian people came to Germany. Well, all these people living here, they were eating, they need a flat and so on. All this, just because we have more people in our country, has pushed GDP. So, did this mean that we had a higher living standard? just because new people in our country are eating our products? No. And therefore, of course, in general, we would say that we look then at the change of real GDP, no price effects, and we divide this by the number of citizens, so per capita. So we also have not only to adjust due to the price changes, we also have to adjust to the population growth. Well, again, if we go back in time for Germany, then we see since the reunification in Germany, we had almost no population growth. Here on the right side, I show you for Germany the population growth rate, and then you see it is just fluctuating about 0% for Germany since reunification until global financial crisis. Well, and then we have the increase. This was Syria, and this, of course, is Ukraine. But also in general, not only because of these two main crises, we had also a speed up of population growth in Germany. And the reason for this is also that in general, we can say after global financial crisis, Germany directly performed economically quite good, relative, especially to other European countries, especially relative to Spain, to Portugal, to Italy, and so on. And what does this mean? And I talked about this when I talked about the construction sector in Spain. Many young people having worked in the construction sector, 20% relative to grow value added in Spain in the beginning of the new millennium. After the burst of this bubble, not very well educated and no jobs anymore in the construction sector in Spain. Well, in this time, many people from Spain moved to Germany because here they could find a job. And so roughly since the global financial crisis, there are coming without these two main crises, Syria and Ukraine, roughly between 200 and 500,000 people are immigrating to Germany since these times. Okay, and then we can say, well, what would be a quantitative aim? And this would be then that for a developed country, it would be nice if we would have an economic growth rate of roughly between 1 and 3%. And why? Compared especially to emerging markets, this is a quite low number. Again, think of the neoclassical production function. We are already at a very high level. And this means it is now quite hard to add something on these high levels in a developed country. And also steady and appropriate growth. This also means this is not the aim that in one year 6%, in the second year -1, in the third year +4, then 0, and so on. So on average, it should also not fluctuating that much during time. But we will later on also talk about the so-called business cycle around this long-term trend. So this should be the long-term growth rate with no large fluctuation around it. Okay, and now we want to go a little bit deeper into this problem that in the definition we have nominal GDP, total market value, so more or less price times quantity, and we want to get rid of these price changes because just overnight doubling all prices doesn't change the economic situation in a country. We are only interested in the difference in quantity. And what we are doing then is, and how this is done comes on the next slide, is we are just calculating real GDP, not taking the prices of today, but we take the prices of the former year. So real GDP prices, quantities of today times prices of the former year, and with this so-called chain calculation we can get rid of the price movement. Well, actually this has just changed this calculation in 2005 because there is an easier concept how we can get rid of this price changes. The easiest concept would be just fixing prices at one time period. Let's say we are measuring everything in prices of the year 2000. Then we held just these prices constant. Well, this was done quite a long time, but of course not always only looking at a price level far behind. We just calculated every quantity in a year relative to some specific price level, and then what we did is we changed always the price level every 5 years. So we moved in time, so to speak. In 1995 we took the price level of let's say 92, and then 2 years later in 1998 or something like this, then we moved the base from 90 to 95, then to 2000 and so on. So, well, why did we do this? Well, of course, we cannot go back that far in history. Think of the 1970s. We cannot take just the price level in 1970 as our baseline, because why? In the 1970s there are many goods and services we didn't have, which we have today. In the 1970s there we don't have any handy or something like this. So, but then why did we change to this chain calculation, always taking the prices in the year before? The reason for this is also, if we are changing the baseline year every 5 years, then we also have always every 5 years to recalculate every real GDP. And this, of course, also means that every 5 years the real GDP growth rates changed. And so in history, we don't have a stable time series. And this is, of course, for statistical reasons, not quite nice. And then, of course, also think about the technological progress. In history, maybe changing the price level every 5 years was quite okay. But again, look at this machine here. This is a quite old one. I think you have a newer one. Your mobile phone compared to a mobile phone 5 years ago, these are quite different goods. A mobile phone today can do much more than a mobile phone which is 5 years old. So the technological progress has speed up quite fast during the last 20 years. And therefore, this is also the reason that we now just calculated with prices of the former year. So, and here is now the definition. What we are doing then, we will do it also just with an example. Don't be afraid because of the formulas. So what we are doing here is GDP at time t plus 1. Let's say this is quantities today times prices of t times prices of yesterday, and then we divide this by nominal GDP of the former year. Here you have the same time index, so this is just nominal GDP of yesterday. Let's say t plus 1 coincides with today and t coincides with yesterday. This is then here just the formulation. So quantities of today and prices t of yesterday, and here quantities of yesterday and prices of yesterday. And then we change this, that we multiply this by the index of yesterday. And this number becomes then the index of today, and here this is the chain, because the index of today depends on the index of yesterday. Here you have this chain process. So, well, and if the today value depends on the value one period before, then of course we need to define a starting point. So we choose just one year in history where we just set these index to 100. Well, of course, this is arbitrary. We can choose any year. But the nice thing is, well, actually, we are not interested in the number of the index or in the number what is real GDP. What we are interested when we pose economic questions, we are interested in the change of real GDP. And of course, the growth rate of any number does not depend at which point you are fixing the number as a starting point. So the growth rate does not depend on the base year where t index of t equals 100. So it doesn't matter if you choose the year 2000 or 2020 or 2017. Well, if you look in some data sets, then you see that we move this index where we set it to 100 also every 5 years. But the reason for this is that in general, we want to have the index number in the neighborhood of 100. But since this doesn't tackle the growth rate, and this is the interesting number, this has no impact on our economic questions. Okay, so what is then the real economic growth rate? Of course, the index of today minus yesterday over yesterday. This is always the same how you calculate any growth rate. Well, and then, of course, we want to get rid of the price changes in our number, but of course we are interested, well, what was the price changes? What were the price changes? And these price changes we are measuring then, oh, not BIP, this is GDP, with the GDP deflator. So this is the overall price index of the economy. And this, of course, is, and with this we will see also in the lecture, not the same as consumer price index. And the change of the consumer price index, this we call inflation. So the change of GDP deflator is something else than inflation. This you should also keep in mind. Well, and here I made also, this also has to be GDP here. Oops. GDP, and this one too. And if you look, especially in older textbooks, also from 2010, 2015, then you quite often find for real GDP only the explanation of these fixed price system. So valuing everything with the same base year. Well, since in the world we changed to this chain index in 2005, especially for all European countries. This is unfortunately wrong. So in this case, be careful. Okay, so this was the theoretical concept, and then we want to do one little example where we look at just a two good economy with quantities M1 and 2 and the price development of P1 and P2. So this is a picture. I think this one I can I click on this? Yeah. So within the slides, if you double click it, then just an Excel sheet is opening. And because, yeah, I can do it by hand, but I also recommend that you are really starting to use all the very helpful things you have on your laptop, on your handy, on your computer, because then you don't have to do it by hand. Okay, so if in 2016 we want to calculate nominal GDP, just using our definition, all goods and services, we have here only two goods, which were produced with quantities 100 and 200 and their market value and summing up. So what do I have then to do in order to calculate nominal GDP? What say the internet? Can just type it in to the chat. Is it working in your slides? Well, this would be then just, yeah, P times X. So 0.9 times 100 plus 2 times 200. So 90 plus 400 is 490. Hopefully this comes out. Yes, here we have it. Well, and why do I do this in Excel? Well, it is always the same thing which we have to do. In the second case, 1 times 100 plus 2 times 210, and this would be 520. But if I already have used here the formula, then I can just copy down this formula and I directly have all the numbers. Oops. So, and then how do I calculate the nominal index? So what I'm doing is just setting 490 equals 100. If then nominal GDP has increased from 490 to 520, how much has then increased the index? What do I have to calculate then? Well, this means 520 to 490 is the number I want to know relative to 100. Let's write down it here. Hopefully this works. So, or 1, this would be 520 to 490 is x over 100. So 100 times 520 over 490. So 520 over 490 times the former index. And of course, this I can also copy down here, and I get all the other index numbers. Let's take also this one here, as that you know where this number comes from. This would be 0.9 times 100 plus 2 times 200. This was then a 1. What would be the growth rate in 2016 nominal? Of course, we don't have any number from 2015. We cannot calculate this one. How much has nominally grown our economy from 2016 to 2017? An increase from 100 to 106 means a growth of some things I think we can calculate in our head still. 6.12%, or? Okay. So this would mean then here we can calculate 106.1 minus 100 over 100. Opening brackets, minus 100 over the former index. This we can also copy down, and I can change it to percent. This would look a little bit nicer. So these are our nominal growth rates. And now we need real GDP. Well, let's go back into our definition. What does it mean? Quantities today times prices of yesterday. Well, oops, next one. If we want to calculate here real GDP, 2016 quantities we have with 100 and 200, but we don't have prices of 2015. So this we cannot calculate, but in 2017 we can calculate this. And this would be then, what do we have to do? You have an idea? This 100 quantity in 2017 times now 0.9 prices in 2016 and plus quantity in 2017, 210 times price 2 in 2016. And this we also can copy down here, and that you later on know what I have done. Well, I will upload it so you can just click in and then you also see the formulas. But anyway, I write down here, where does this 510 comes from? So this would be this times this and this times this. 0.9 times 100 plus 2 times 210 is 510. 10, and this has been 6.12%, and this x is 106.12. Okay, and now we go to this chain definition of index of real GDP. So now we have this value, real GDP. We have to divide it by the nominal GDP of the former year and multiplying with the index of the former year. And there we said we can choose just 1 year as a starting point where we can set the index to 100. And this I did here. I just set index of 2016 to 100. So within this cell, I take real GDP of 2017, 510 equals 510 over nominal GDP of the former year, 490, times the real GDP index of the former year, and this is the 100. Just taking the formula and calculating the numbers. And this moves then, of course, also on in time. So let's take this one too. 5. Here we have 510 over 490 times 100 equals 104.8. Well then, growth rate, as always, if you want to calculate profit growth rate, if you want to take your revenue profit, always number today minus number yesterday over number yesterday. Well, this we already have done here, and since it's just the same formula, I can copy this formula and put it in here. But also that you can recapitulate this. 6 means 104.08 minus 100 over 100 is 4.08%. So, and then how was the price development? If we focus, now we have the development of real numbers, and also we are interested, well, what is then the price effect? And for this, we calculate the GDP deflator. Let's go back into our definition. We take the nominal index over the real index and multiplying with 100. The 100 is again conventions that we end up with an index in the neighborhood of 100. Okay, then let's go in our sheet. So here, this we could directly write down because all indices are 100, and then here also 100 has to come out, but the formula is nominal index over real index, and by definition multiply this by 100. And this then we move down here And that you are not puzzled, I'm not calculating the 100 down here. I take this one, and this one would be then the 106.2 over 104.08 times 100. So 106.12 over 104.08 times 100 is 101.96. So, and of course, growth rate. So what was the price effect? The price changes. Again, the same as before. This is then 101.96 minus 100 over 100 is 1.96%. Well, 3 minutes left, and then I can do this also. What is average growth per year of real GDP? So real GDP growth rate we have just here. What would be the average growth rate? This hopefully you have done in your math courses. Averaging growth rates, what you have to do. Idea? Or in the internet? How do you average growth rates? Summing up all growth rates dividing by 3? No, but yeah. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, but it's the right direction. So what we are, or what we have to keep in mind, here we have the index, and the index of 2016, this was 100. And then after 3 years, we end up with an index of 199.99. So I of 2019 is 119.99. So, and now we ask which constant growth rate every year ends up by calculating 100 up to 119.99. So what we are interested is 100 times our average growth rate in the first year. So this is 2017. In the second year, now the same growth rate, 2018 times the growth rate in 2019 equals 190.99. Well, this together we can of course write as 1 plus g bar to the power of 3. And then we end up with, let's go here, 199.99 over 100 equals 1 plus g bar to the power of 3. And we want to solve for the average growth rate. And this means we have to choose the third root of 199 over 100 and subtracting 1. So, and if we look, let me just give 1 or 2 minutes. What is this here? This we can write in another way, and then you see what is the averaging process. This we can also write as 190.9 over, and now I take the index of 2018, 112.09 times 112.09 over, and now I take the index of 2017, 104.08 times 104.08 over 100 to the power of 1/3. Power of 1/3 is the same as taking the third root. I hope that you know this, yeah? So, why did I wrote this down here? Well, this and this cancels. This and this cancels, so we end up just with 199 over 100. So this is just the same, what we have written down here on the right side. But what is this here? These are the growth factors of 2017 to 2019. And how is it called? Multiplying three numbers, taking the third root. This is just the geometric mean. Have you talked about different means in mathematics? Or in statistics? Statistics, then it's good if you have already seen it. Well, the arithmetic mean this is just defined as, let's take two numbers, x1 plus x2 times 1/2. Yeah? This we always have in mind when we are averaging. But there are other means which we need, and the geometric mean, this is just defined as x1 times x2, and now we are just moving this 1/2 up as an exponent. So what we are just doing is interchanging the plus sign with the multiplication and multiplying by 1/2, taking the root or taking the exponent of 1/2. And please keep in mind the geometric mean is needed if you are averaging growth rates. In many textbooks it's done with the arithmetic mean, but this is only an approximation, and the arithmetic mean you can only choose approximately if growth rates are lower than 10%. This you should keep in mind. Okay, then if for the finish, let's take just the average growth rate, that we have also the number, and this would be then 199 over 100 to the power of 1/3 minus 1 is 6.6, and if we take the arithmetic mean, then you see, oops, oh, oh, equals, that these two numbers are differing. Percent and not very much, but we see it here. And if, because here we have numbers less than 10%, and if we are going to nominal GDP, taking just this column here, then you see we already have a difference here of 0.1 percentage points. And this you should keep in mind. Okay, so that it was for today.